All right. Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News. I am your host, Greg Stoker, and we are doing a solo episode today, and we are finally talking about Syria, a very polarizing and controversial topic. I'm currently looking at the screen right now, and I don't know what's happening with my fancy microphone being all fuzzy. There we go. And this is, of course, hugely emotional and devastating for so many people. People have had almost a week to kind of figure out what's going on. I mean, it's one of the most dynamic and complex conflict zones in the modern world. So a week isn't enough, obviously, but know this: Syria is both a victim of its own government, whose historic brutality is not just CIA propaganda. Like, come on, guys. And great power politics. The vision of a regime change in Syria died some years ago, and the Assad government isn't going anywhere at the moment. We're going to be focusing on, the latter, the great power politics. The Arab League has welcomed back Bashar al-Assad, or at least has started to tolerate him again. Russia is, here to stay in the region. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to the United States, has accepted that Assad is here to stay and not going anywhere either. The relationship with Iran, the Gulf states, et cetera, et cetera. I know that this reality is hateful to a lot of people. Then some people say, like, you need to back the Assad government no matter what, because the reasoning from some of my Marxist-Leninist comrades would be like, you either stand with the resistance or with the agents of imperialism. It cannot be both. You can have your critiques of Assad, however, supporting terrorism and Western-backed regime change that threatens the world's ability to break free from the chains of capitalist fascism is quite simply unacceptable. Choose your battles tactically, not with bourgeois liberal moralism. Oh, I do think it's, from my own perspective, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I also am 0% convinced that Western imperialists want regime change in Syria. We're going to be exploring these topics today in a way that I haven't seen anyone do quite yet. And I am just going to stay in my lane and talk about why this rebel blitz by HTS and other groups, which we'll begin to talk about, is pretty much destined to fail, and what you need to know about it. So I do perhaps possess some unique insight into this conflict, at least from a military perspective, seeing that when I was in 2nd Ranger Battalion in the fall of 2013, after Assad used chemical weapons, he wasn't the only party to do that in Syria, by the way. We don't think so, which was Obama's red line. If he uses chemical weapons, we're going in. We definitely started drawing up plans to jump in and do a mass airborne assault to seize Damascus International Airport. It never happened. obviously, as it became increasingly apparent that the Assad government would not fall without direct military intervention, right? Which would bring in Russia and Iran, perhaps into a hot shooting war. And after Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and other interventions in the political will and public consent for another high visibility regime change war. And who knew what would come out of that? What kind of regional instability or Frankenstein monster would be birthed from that? ISIS was already around as a product of the Iraq War and a power vacuum in some parts of Syria, and no one knew where it was going to go. And also, Russia, brokered a deal where Assad agreed to give up his chemical weapons. But did he? Anyways, it gave Obama an excuse to back down from an unwise public red line where we'd have to go in and directly confront the Syrian army. Not saying that, U.S. air assets didn't bomb them. And look, it was a messy war. It started off as what I think was a civil war, and then it turned into, from my perspective, a dirty war. And I don't want this to be a Western-centric episode, but I did grow up in the defense establishment. The reasons why the U.S. are involved is to deny Iran, Hezbollah a supply line to protect Israel, to deny Russia a stable military footprint in the region, contain the remnants of ISIS, create a potential oil pipeline with comprador states like Qatar through Syria to Europe, and thereby isolate Iran and Russia from the global oil market, and thereby eventually isolate China, etc. And of course, as President Trump famously said, just a good old simple reason for why sometimes the United States is in West Asia. Big surprise.
And they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil. I took over.
We're taking the oil. We're not taking
well,
the oil.
Maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
They're protecting the facility.
Even Laura Ingraham, far-right pundit and anchor, is trying to push back on Trump a few years ago. Like, we're not really taking the oil. It's like, no. We're there exclusively to take the oil. Even she was trying to all right.
Maybe we should take it, but we have the oil. Right now, the United States has the oil. So they say he left troops in Syria. No, I got rid of all of them other than we're protecting the oil.
It's one thing I do like about Trump. I don't like it. It's just more convenient that he doesn't lie about it like Democrats do. There's the same foreign policy informed by, imperial capitalism, but he doesn't lie about it. He doesn't have to say we're here to protect democracy. No, first of all, we're going to discuss in this episode why the United States would never allow for an actual democratic government that could actually nationalize its resources to exist in Syria. Neither would Russia as well. So, he doesn't spend time with this pro-democracy hogwash that has never existed in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the global South, and probably never will. So, I guess he's an odious individual, but at least he's honest about stuff. So, he doesn't hide his imperialist intentions behind the veneer of upholding democracy. It's something we can expect from his administration coming in. The U.S. does not want a democracy in Syria with territorial sovereignty. It wants a frozen conflict with a stable leader, the devil and it doesn't want anyone to try and nationalize those resources. Russia doesn't want a democracy either that could demand it disband its military port and bases in the country. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to great power interests in Syria. There's also the Gulf states. There's also Turkey. And this is like an entire, college syllabus for an undergrad course. But we're going to try to get the salient points in, and that is that this HTS rebel offensive ain't gonna work. Last week, I and one of my colleagues, and we can put some B-roll here, said on a podcast that after the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire was accepted, Syria was going to kick off. In the hours before it took effect, the Israeli Air Force bombed all official crossings and bridges on the Syrian-Lebanon border with the operational objective of denying the primary supply line of munitions and equipment from Iran across the Levant into Lebanon. So when we said Syria was going to, okay, I guess my producer's nowhere to be found. Sorry, guys. When we said Syria was going to kick off, I meant a massive bombing campaign to target Hezbollah supply lines. I don't think anyone thought that the Syrian rebels would launch an offensive. It came out now that HTS and the SNA, Syrian National Army, mostly HTS and backup, we're going to get into this group. Basically a slightly chilled out version of Al-Qaeda with a new paint job here in a second. But first, we're going to do the history of this conflict and kind of talk about it in a roundabout way. We don't have time to break it down from the origins and the protests in 2000, the 10s, 11, 12, and then when it became totally unhinged in 2013, 14 with the advent of al-Nusra and ISIS trying to basically outdo one another for influence in Syria. And then al-Nusra tries to rebrand, break affiliations with Al-Qaeda. And these are, of course, are Salafi Sunni movements because they want political legitimacy. They have political aspirations. So they wanted to try to, get themselves taken off the Western terrorist watch list, which they haven't. They're still classified by the United States and the UN as a terrorist organization. But anyways, they tried to do a rebrand like the Taliban, and that's where we're at right now. They still have a lot of radical members. And yeah, so look, we will see in the end that this rebel blitz isn't going to work because, in short, the rebels can't defeat the Assad government militarily, especially with no air superiority. So they did this blitz in hopes that it would cause a mutiny or some sort of coup or political upheaval within the Assad government. It didn't, and the rebels aren't a monolith. Okay, there are factions, there's infighting. They don't really have a definable plan. At least HTS hasn't released one, at least not one that they're shared publicly. They have said publicly, they've stated, one of their operations room has stated, our fight is with the Assad government. It's not with the Russians, which signals to me that they might want to have the Russians, after they take enough territory and are able to hold it over the next few months, have the Russians kind of, and maybe the Turks come in and serve as mediators for a new security relationship within the region between HTS, Syrian National Army, perhaps, and the Assad government. But the Assad government doesn't seem to be going anywhere. They're trying to basically do what we're seeing in, like, with the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk, take a bunch of land, hold on to it, hopefully bargain that into diplomatic concessions going forward. Even the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria said that, one second, let me pull it up, guys. A lot of this news is breaking right now. U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, Geir Peterson, says the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is leading the terrorist attack, is classified as a terrorist organization by the United Nations. He adds there is no military solution to this conflict. There's a lot of signals now that all of the initial, I would say, sensationalism. I mean, it was a sensational assault, but now that all of the sensationalism is kind of dying down, we're kind of seeing more possibility of a political solution, or that HTS might actually look for a political solution going forward. Again, that's one of the reasons why they have publicly signaled to Russia, our fight's not with you. Of course, they're still going to get bombed by Russian aircraft, but they're basically looking for an improved security situation. So look, that's the basic premise that we're going with. Beyond that, they don't really have a defined, again, public military plan. It's giving IDF, honestly. Anyways, that's the thesis that I'll try to prove here in a bit. Let's get into it. So here's a pretty neoliberal telling of the Syrian civil war. So a peaceful protest. Of course, this is like, it began in 2011. It didn't. It began, with the rise of the Assad dynasty, and even before that with Western interventionism in West Asia. But we're just going to start with the outbreak of hostilities. A peaceful protest movement calling for democracy and dignity. Again, neoliberal retelling. Emerged in 2011. Doesn't mean that a lot of the points aren't what I would call factual, but still grain of salt, because they do not mention CIA or Israeli intelligence or Turkish or NATO involvement at all in this. But a peaceful protest movement calling for democracy and dignity that emerged in 2011 was met with brute, deadly force by Syrian President Bashar Assad's security forces. By early summer 2012, a large-scale armed rebellion was underway. At first, Assad's poorly motivated, ill-disciplined army was a poor match for the Sunni-led popular rebellion. I would agree with this assessment militarily. Of course, they revamped their military in the years since then. The minority Alawite-led regime had persecuted, subjugated, and discriminated against much of the country's Sunni majority for decades. I know a number of Sunni Syrians who probably agree with this. This was to be a moment of reckoning. So enter Russia. It just says in this retelling I found in the Washington Post, enter Russia. No other reason than they just wanted a military foothold in the region. It had nothing to do with U.S.-funded and Israeli-funded militias in Syria, composed largely of foreign fighters, had killed over 100,000 Syrian troops. But yeah, let's not mention that. Enter Russia, primarily to protect its own interests in the Middle East and its naval base in Latakia, which is on the Syrian coast, Syria's principal port city and strategically important foothold in the Mediterranean. So Moscow provided air, weapon, and artillery support for the regime, as well as mercenary fighters. And then Iran, long an ally and sponsor of the Assad in Syria, is a key node in its axis of resistance. Yes, Syria is very important for intelligence and weapons flow towards the wider axis of resistance in the region. And Iran stepped up its military presence to protect its client. They're describing Syria as a client of Iran, and secure weapons flows and influence. And they're using the word client here because they're trying to build the image of Iran being an imperial power that can have client states, which is ridiculous. All right. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. And secure weapons flow and influence. So Hezbollah, also the Iranian-sponsored group designated as a terrorist organization by the United States and others, flooded the front lines with some of its best fighters. They went in to, quote, break the back of ISIS, according to, how am I mind blanking? Nasrallah, Jesus Christ. Yeah, that's the wording he used. Together they halted and ultimately reversed the rebel advance, although never completely, as the rebels clung to a small corner of northwest Syria called Idlib. So we're going to look at a real-time updated open source intelligence map of all the engagements going on here in a minute. But they were relegated, and then they broke out and they took Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria and its financial and cultural hub. And so Assad cannot allow that to be taken. So there's going to be some urban warfare for the next few months. So this ragtag group of fighters that had risen up to protect a growing popular protest movement had expected the West to rally to its side, as it had done in Libya. I have no idea what this WAPO sentence means. What? But despite some assistance from Gulf Arab states and others, as well as verbal support from the US and Europe, I don't know what this journalist is on. We gave them over $1 billion of funding. There was never any meaningful support that would change the balance of power on the ground. I completely disagree with that. The rebel alliance fractured in segments, became increasingly radicalized, giving birth first to the al-Qaeda-affiliated Jabhat al-Nusra and eventually to ISIS. Again, they started competing against one another. With millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, and a historic refugee crisis spilling into Turkey. Keep in mind this refugee crisis when it comes to European policy. for what the West and Europe wants politically, because the political landscape of America and Europe has changed drastically since the 2010s. And what's the biggest policy concern right now? Immigration into Europe. So that's a consideration when it comes to controlling the dimensions of this Syrian conflict when it comes to Western leaders. The Syrian conflict became largely ignored, and the front lines ostensibly froze for 9 long years. Yes, it's been a frozen conflict for 9 long years. I agree with that. With millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, and a historic refugee crisis. Oh my God, I said that. Until last week, on Wednesday, the Reformed Rebel Alliance under the flag of HTS suddenly started to sweep through northwestern Syrian countryside. Okay, to call it a rebel alliance, like to harken back to Star Wars, is kind of ridiculous. There's like 5 different large factions. You've got HTS, which is Al-Qaeda with a new paint job, a more politically acceptable paint job. You've got the Syrian National Army, which comes out of the Free Syria, which is the Turkish-backed group in northern Syria. Again, we're going to look at the map. And then you've got Rojava, which is the AANES, the autonomous area of like northeast Syria, which is the Kurds, the Kurdish militias that exist both on the Syrian side and the Turkish side of the border. Turkey doesn't like them, but they are the biggest U.S. allies amongst the rebel factions. They are the poster child for U.S. aid, military aid into Syria. They'll fight HTS. They'll fight the Syrian National Army. None of these, like to describe all these things as like a rebel alliance that is cohesive, is insane. I don't know what this guy's on. However, according, but it's, still condemned. This HTS is still condemned by the U.S., Turkey, and other countries as a terrorist organization. And the media, when hostilities first broke out right after the ceasefire, as a lot of people thought they might, just didn't expect it to be a massive invasion. We thought the media the Western media started to describe them as like the Syrian rebels going against the horrible Assad regime, which, I'm not, again, a fan of that or that guy, but to leave out that these are actual former Al-Qaeda affiliates, many of whom are still radical. I mean, there are different factions within HTS, of course, but that's a key piece of information, because you keep saying that Hamas and Hezbollah are considered terrorist organizations according to the U.S. But, for the first few days, they didn't really mention it. But now you have U.S. special envoys saying, no, they are a terrorist organization. You have U.S. politicians saying like, no, they're a terrorist organization. So now the media is finally being like, okay, we need to toe the political line. So they're actually getting somewhat better about that. All right. So I know this is a ton of information. It's complicated. You have literally allies like Turkey and the United States backing different factions that don't like each other. It's kind of crazy. Then you also have U.S. forces in the South protecting the oil, just protecting the oil. So let's get into some news real quick to just mix things up. This was reported. This was CNN from a couple hours ago.
Turning now to a reignited war in Syria. CNN is learning Syrian and Russian jets are stepping up joint strikes on opposition forces in the northern part of the country. Syria's volunteer rescue group, the White Helmet, says airstrikes on Sunday have killed dozens of people. And this comes in retaliation for that sudden offensive that cost the Syrian regime control of the country's second largest city, Aleppo. Rebel forces also say they are expanding their control in the country, claiming.
All right. Yeah, they are expanding their control. Okay, so let's look at this map real quick. Oh, this is a crappy map. It doesn't have the Turkish-backed forces on it. Oh, yes, it does. Okay, you got the Turkish-backed forces kind of in this striped pattern, this black and yellow stripe pattern. Their goal is probably going to be to expand the buffer zone between Turkey and in parts of Syria, the government and Kurdish-controlled Syria. I do think that Turkey's going to try to contain the dimensions of this. Then you've got the Kurdish forces, one of U.S.'s bigger allies. And then if you see the blue at Tanf on the Jordanian border, that is U.S. and partner forces, anti-government forces, problematic. And then you have these outlets of blue. These are going to be a mixture of U.S. combat outposts and also like oil refineries that Trump just said we're just straight up guarding. Then you have these small pockets of Islamic State fighters that still exist. This is an okay map. Then you have Syrian rebels. This is the HTS and affiliated groups in yellow, and they exploded out of Idlib right after the ceasefire. No one was expecting it. And, you know, there's this whole like puppet master narrative, like, you know, they're doing it to protect Israel, destabilize the land corridor connecting Iran with Hezbollah for munitions and supply and equipment. However, I would just like to posit for some of y'all that they had no better strategic opportunity to attack than right now. Okay. Before we continue, I'm going to explain kind of why. Because in 2020, Russia and Turkey kind of worked out like a ceasefire, frozen conflict between, you know, the rebel forces and the Syrian government. Syrian government had kind of started to demilitarize because they kind of trusted in that. That's why they were caught so off guard. I mean, it was still a massive intelligence failure that the Syrian government didn't see this massive attack coming, which is kind of weird. And yeah, and so from the perspective of HTS, they didn't really want to attack while Hezbollah was still on a war footing with Israel. They didn't want to kind of send the region into conflict. Also, they are waging a PR campaign. They want to be the focus of that, the liberators of Aleppo from the authoritarian regime. There's a lot of different reasons. And also, they wanted to wait till Hezbollah was completely off the board, until all the border crossings from Syria into Lebanon were destroyed, until there was a ceasefire with Israel that Hezbollah is trying to maintain. There's just not a better strategic opportunity. Hezbollah is like the scariest force in all of this. I mean, that and Russian air assets. So, yeah, it makes the most sense that they would, for their own purposes, attack at that time. Just have to put that out there for the sake of fairness.
They have now made significant gains in the northern countryside of Aleppo, capturing several towns and villages. The rebels' success poses the biggest challenge to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in years. For its part, Moscow says it will continue to support him. CNN's Clarissa Ward joins us now live from Beirut. When we look at this, Clarissa, this came as a surprise.
All right, y'all. Clarissa Ward, CNN journalist who faked ducking and taking more rocket fire on October 7th. Yeah, let's see what she has to say.
For so many people, how was the opposition able to take so much ground and do it so quickly?
Well, Erica, as you said, this took people by complete surprise. Nobody was anticipating this. These are the largest terror.
I will say, in fairness, most Western analysts were anticipating this. But some people did have wind that an attack was coming. It would make sense that after a ceasefire. But when she says no one saw that, that's kind of incorrect.
Territorial gains that we've seen for the rebels in 8 years. It had been largely quiet in Syria. There had been a sort of de facto no war, no peace. And that's because, in a sense, Bashar al-Assad was able to quash the opposition. He did that not through the strength of his own military or military rule, but through various very powerful backers, the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah. If you look at where we are now in this moment, Iran, very distracted by the losses on the battlefield of its various proxies, also facing strikes from Israel. Hezbollah, clearly battered.
To say that Iran was beaten by Israeli airstrikes is kind of crazy, but yes, continue.
By Israel and Russia, very much distracted and preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, you can get a feel or a sense for why the rebels felt that now was perhaps the moment to try to strike while there is this vacuum of sorts, and while it is so unclear who would be able to step in and fill the void and give Bashar al-Assad the support that he would need to once again quash this rebellion. Though at this stage, as you said, the momentum does seem to be on the rebels' side. They have full control of Idlib province now. They have full control of...
Okay, that didn't age well. That didn't age well at all. The advance has been pretty much halted in Hama, the next big city south of Aleppo. They really haven't even been able to penetrate the northern suburbs. The Syrian army has regrouped, and now HTS is getting hammered by Russian and Syrian air superiority, which we knew was coming because unlike Hezbollah and Hamas, they don't have tunnels. And it's not like southern Lebanon where this is good ground for guerrilla warfare. It's literally a lot of open terrain where you're going to get smashed by aerial bombs.
The central city of Aleppo, or the central part.
And yes, I see someone in the comments saying the Iran and Russia too weak to help narrative is ridiculous. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
Parts of Aleppo making gains in Aleppo countryside, also at the doorstep of the central city of Hama. So it remains to be seen how exactly Assad's backers are going to save him once again, though, as you mentioned, we have seen those Russian airstrikes stepping up in the last couple of days, Eric.
My favorite part about CNN analysis is that they explain the situation, like some of the facts on the ground, and they just say, it remains to be seen. So you can never be like, you can never challenge them on anything.
You mentioned whether they'll be able to save him again. It has been key, right, to Bashar al-Assad's ability to stay in power, to have that support. How much of a threat does this pose to his power at this point?
I think it's a significant threat, although it's very difficult to see what happens next and what indeed the goals are of the rebels and their various backers. As I mentioned before, we are seeing...
Again, their goals would probably take as much territory and hope for political upheaval inside Damascus, maybe a coup or a military mutiny that we saw during the first Syrian civil war, where you had a lot of Syrian army Sunni individuals defecting in droves to the Free Syrian Army. That didn't happen. If it was going to happen, it probably already would have happened. And yeah, it seems like a pretty secure government to me.
An uptick now in those Russian strikes. And when we look back to 2015, which is when Russia entered the Syrian arena, and when they really doubled down with an incredibly cruel but very effective mass bombardment of civilian areas across rebel-held territory, it is clear that the Russians can make that decisive difference once again. The question that remains, though, is whether they have the appetite to do that in this moment, or whether they are trying to conserve their energy and their resources for the ongoing battle in Ukraine.
Really, guys? I mean, they're hoping that Russia is completely distracted by the war in Ukraine, which, you know, they have a secure position in, and that this upheaval in Georgia is going to distract them. But I mean, all they have to do is provide air superiority. That's literally it. The Syrian army, the popular mobilization forces, the Shia Iraqi militias are already crossing the border. Again, the initial rebel HTS Blitz has been stopped. Like once they lose the initiative, once they lose momentum, they're just going to get hammered by air power. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. But cool. Thanks, CNN. We're about to move on. Let's finish this segment.
I will say that after sort of a couple of days of incredibly fast momentum on behalf of the rebels, today it does feel like some of those gains are slowing down a bit. There had been many rumors about the possibility of certain factions of the Syrian army potentially defecting. We haven't yet been able to get a clear sense of whether that really is happening and what the impact of it would be.
No, it's not happening. Also, there were initial reports of a palace coup where security forces general were searching for Assad's family while he was visiting the Kremlin. That appears to have been complete disinformation and didn't happen. So,
if so, at this stage, not clear yet whether Bashar al-Assad can survive this, although I will say, having covered Syria for many, many years, Erica, that there have been a number of occasions in the past where people assumed that he could not survive, and he went on to prove them wrong, Erica.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Clarissa Ward, for saying a lot and not saying a lot at the same time. Impressive. And then someone in the comments said, there it is. They believe they're still living in 2015. Yeah. Cool. So now, guys, let's check out okay, well, first of all, I think here is a couple of considerations we have to, take into account. What began as this blitz, this shock assault, may have created, from the Syrian government's perspective, an opportunity to end this kind of frozen conflict, limbo state in the country's north, the province of Idlib, which has been a rebel stronghold for a long time, which there was kind of this amnesty going on, and provide Damascus and its allies like Russia a way to sidestep like unproductive de-escalation understandings. And now the Syrian state has like legitimacy in finally dealing with their Idlib problem, and according to, I think, informed sources, the militants are unlikely to remain in an advantageous position for a long time for, several key reasons. First of all, again, going to have to retake Aleppo. That's going to take a long time. They're going to dig in. It's going to be urban warfare for months. And then they're going to probably, after this happened, deal with Idlib. Again, heavy bombing of the province. And that's going to take years. So this conflict's kicked off again. And there's the U.S. Special Envoy even said there is no military solution to this. It's going to have to be political, but the military action is going to happen for some time. First, there has been a large imminent arrival of Syrian military reinforcements to this area, which will not allow Aleppo to fall into the hands of foreign-backed extremists and just have that be an acceptable situation. So they're going to push them back from Hama, get them out in the open, drop formations of enemy technicals or rebel technicals, vehicles, and force them back to Aleppo. First contain them, and then have to do an urban clearance, which is going to be gnarly. It's going to be painful. They will remain active battlefields. These Turkish, U.S. and Turkish-backed militant groups are less likely to achieve their goals today than in the early years of the war because of seismic political economic shifts in Europe that I alerted to, which fears, again, this revival of the Syrian conflict and another flood of refugees into its borders. And also, third, Damascus, Assad himself, as a figurehead, has returned to the Arab fold, the Arab League, by rejoining that body and being welcomed by actually several Persian Gulf states. The UAE, he had a phone call with the UAE, and he has the UAE's backing. Totally a problematic government, but it just goes to show that he's now a fixture and is going to be very hard to dislodge. Those capitals are no longer interested in backing jihadists. Like even Qatar, with its own comprador interests about that back United States interests, they're no longer interested in a revival of the ISIS terror craze, resuscitating the war or destabilizing Lebanon and Iraq, Syria's direct connected neighbors at this moment. Bad for business, bad for international plans and trade and their bottom line. Then they're also not interested in opening up like the Syrian military arena to Iranian advisors or forces. Again, even the U.S. has been trying to leverage sanctions to get Assad, to tempt Assad away from Iran and take a more neutral position with regards to Iran. And now this HTS assault has basically just put his government, and by extension Russia, who now has an increasing security relationship with Iran, further into the fold. So this is actually a policy problem from some of the from a United States perspective. Now there is another perspective which basically says that this entire assault was initiated with the cooperation of Israeli and Turkish intelligence, because there is a big working relationship between Turkey and Israel in terms of intelligence collaboration. That this was used to not necessarily like overthrow the Assad government, although some people do think that's what the goal is, even though Israeli officials have for the past 10 years, intelligence officials have been putting into the narrative that they don't want to overthrow the Assad regime. And I kind of do believe them, even though they're inherently untrustworthy, because how deeply traumatic the power vacuum that led to the Islamic State was for the entire region is something that's scaring even the Persian Gulf states. So they definitely don't want, they're definitely leery of HTS or a former Al-Qaeda affiliate taking over, creating some sort of Frankenstein government, and nobody knows what that looks like. That's a major concern as well. The destabilization for the region is bad for imperialist reasons, like controlled instability, the Balkanization of Syria with, you've got the Kurds, and then you've got the Syrian National Army, and then you got the rebels, and then you got the little U.S. controlled portion where there's no sovereign territorial integrity, but it's like frozen and it's controlled. That's kind of what U.S. policy thrives on. But massive uncontrolled conflicts where you don't know what's going to happen, I haven't seen that personally. So how will it affect the outcome now that Syria has rejoined the Arab League? Well, there's a normalization process. It just means Assad, as a president, he was kind of like a pariah, definitely a pariah during the outset of the Syrian civil war. Now he's just kind of normalized with people. He's become less of a pariah. It took a long time, but again, he's a stable political fixture now. So if these Western war hawk think tanks are being like, yeah, there's going to be a palace coup, there's going to be a massive revolution. Y'all have been saying that about Russia for the past 3 years. So like, why the hell is anybody listening to y'all anymore? So it's the typical like imperialist narrative where you have this government that's like really strong and really dangerous to our allies, but also so weak it's almost about to collapse. They do the same thing with Iran. It's the octopus of terror, but that's also a post-revolutionary state that's about to collapse. Russia, the ruble's collapsing, it's about to fall. Well, you said that 3 years ago. What happened? So there's definitely a lot of disconnect, but I do think, based off of what I've heard Jake Sullivan say, the national security advisor, the President Biden, who's not really a reliable source for anything, and other senior U.S. officials, it kind of seems, even since 2015, that the dream of a regime change in Syria kind of went down the drain. Because remember, in 2015, John Kerry, Obama's Secretary of State, went to Russia, had a 3-hour meeting in 2015, came out, in the Kremlin, came out and told the press, the U.S. is no longer interested in a regime change in Syria. And that's when, we started brokering terms for a frozen conflict. So, yeah. Anyways, so I just wanted to point those couple points out. And then I do want to hear General Wesley Clark's, what he has to say about this. I generally like him. He's like one of the better ex-U.S. generals. He was in charge of NATO. But then again, he did break the news, kind of did some whistleblowing on the fact, like during the lead up to the Iraq war, they had this entire target deck of who we're going to hit. The countries were Afghanistan, Iraq, then Iran, then Syria, then Libya, then Somalia, then Yemen. Yeah, he was the one who was like, yeah, we're going to create this neoconservative vision of a new Middle East. And he was like, why are we doing this? It's like, because we can. Well, it turns out we couldn't. But anyways, let's see what he has to say.
It is an excellent point. Really appreciate your insight, your expertise on this as well, Clarissa. Thank you.
The city video shows chaos in Aleppo as people scramble in the moments just before an explosion. Just a warning, the video you're about to watch is graphic. Unbelievable. New pictures also appear to show rebel fighters with tanks that were abandoned by Syrian forces. Retired General Wesley Clark joins us now. He's the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. General Clark, what are your thoughts on what looks like just a tinderbox in Syria right now? What's next, do you think?
So I think we're going to see a continued back and forth struggle between the Turkish-backed forces and the Syrian forces. I think Russia will weigh in increasingly. Russia can't afford to lose Bashar Assad as an ally. It can't afford to lose its footprint in the region, and Russia is going to commit additional resources there. Turkey wants to end this with a little more terrain in northwest Syria. Yeah. And greater credibility. So I think this is going to go on for a while.
I mean, the Russians are already stretched pretty thin in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on whether Bashar al-Assad is in danger of losing some power here if this continues in this direction?
Bashar can't afford to lose Aleppo. It's the economic, cultural center of Syria. So he's going to throw whatever he's got into this fight. He doesn't have Hezbollah as an ally. Iran.
Yeah, Wesley Clark. Okay, I know he's like NATO to the core, but we do listen to opposition analysis.
Iran is weakened. Russia is under pressure, but I think you're going to see a long, tough fight around Aleppo. So it's not clear that Bashar is going to give up on it. He's not going to fall back. He's not going to peacefully go into the night. This is going to be a really intense, painful struggle.
And General Clark, as you know, U.S. troops are in the region. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan addressed this issue. Here's what he had to say.
At the moment, we believe that our forces who are stationed in Syria to fight ISIS are not at proximate risk because they are in a different part of the country from where this particular offensive is taking place. But they are under a different kind of threat. They are still under a threat from Iran and the Shia-backed militia groups in Iraq and Syria.
Give me a break. Iran's not going to attack U.S. troops right now at this junction. Frigging Jake Sullivan. God damn it.
Syria.
Yeah, General, how much danger is there for U.S. troops in that region right now?
I don't think there's a great danger right now, but I do think that what's going to happen is this fighting will spread, and U.S. allies, the YPG, the friendly Kurds who have been working with the United States, are definitely a target of Turkey. And so if Turkey's successful and its forces are successful, they're going to turn on the YPG, and this will involve U.S. interests. So there's risk there. And Jim, remember at the same time what we're not covering, but what's actually happening in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. 30 some odd years, 35 years, an independent country, now turning away from the West under a new political party, and lots of protests in the street. And I can assure you this really has Russia's attention.
Yeah, that's another unstable situation. You're absolutely right. We'll continue to follow that as well. General Clark, thanks for bringing.
I mean, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, U.S. troops aren't like at risk, but whatever. They're there to guard the oil anyways. So, okay. All these crypt keepers, all these crypt keeper pundits that, basically said, the global war on terror was winnable. Why do we listen to them? Just because establishment thinking is very important to take into your consideration. So, the friendly Kurds, you mean the ones helping U.S. steal Syrian oil? Again, guys, this is a really complicated conflict, but the bottom line is, if you are how do I word this? Because I want to give a unifying message. The Syrian government, the integrity of the Syrian government, without a regime change, which I'm not convinced the United States wants. I'm not convinced Turkey wants it. I'm not even convinced Israel wants it. Destabilization, a weakening of the axis of resistance with Israel, with Iran, absolutely. This will mess with Hezbollah's supply lines. This will keep them off the board. They will not re-enter this conflict at this moment because they will be targeted by Israeli airstrikes, which they weren't during the first iteration of the Syrian civil war. So the situation on the ground has completely changed for Hezbollah as well. And again, there are internalized fractions and contradictions within these rebel forces. They're backed by different countries. They fight each other. They have opposing interests. It's a mess, just like it was in 2011, 12, 13 to 15. However, the political situation in America and Europe has changed. Someone in the comments said they're still acting like it's 2015. It's not 2015 anymore. HTS is not going to, if the government was going to topple, most likely going to do so rapidly, which is what they hoped for during the opening days of the war in Ukraine. There was all those economist articles about a palace coup happening at any moment. Putin's so worried about assassinations that he's, broadcasting from a fake Kremlin studio. They're being more discriminating about the reporting about this because it's a very volatile situation that can shift at any moment. It's important to note that the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has endorsed the Assad government as tactically and strategically necessary for the resistance movement. Remember, Hamas and the PFLP did pull out of Syria and condemn Assad's crackdown on protesters in 2011 and 2012, but because of strategic considerations, even though they're not the biggest fans, even Sinwar, said that they have to get, they have to do this endorsement. So yeah, I guess some of my tanky friends are kind of right in that if you do support the resistance, it's got to be somewhat unequivocal. I don't know if I can bring myself to that completely, but this is kind of like a rundown. I just wanted to give some perspective that I haven't been hearing a lot, and that's like everyone's like they want a full-on regime change. It's like I have not seen any evidence of that. I see contained, controlled chaos. Sorry, I'm getting over a flu. Yes, someone says, oh yeah, also in Lebanon, the IDF are not ceasing fire. Okay, let's do some questions real quick. Greg, why do you think the Axis hasn't been more forceful? I mean, well, we'd be lying if they said they haven't been hit hard. Some things are stressed to capacity. And again, Iran has said specifically this could be one reason. They don't need to. Israel's still in a dire position. The United States is losing credibility and soft power throughout the world. But Iran said explicitly, and some other movements too, they're going to wait for Operation True Promise 3 and for an escalation and a reprisal against Israel to see what Trump's policy is going to be. These are savvy political organizations that are able to exercise strategic patience. So they're waiting for a new administration to see if he can be worked with, if they need to respond with more force, if he will be insane and start carpet bombing everything. Nobody knows because he's a wild card. So a big part of the strategic patience and not escalating right now is to kind of see what Trump is going to do. Now, he has stocked his cabinet full of idiotic war hawks that are like Zionist and to the max. So who knows? But NATO out of Syria. Yeah, isn't the North Atlantic Treaty Organization supposed to be a defensive alliance? Defending Europe and in Syria? Hell yeah. Okay. Situation in Georgia now is the same as Ukraine situation in 2013, 2014. I'm going to have to look at that. I have not had the bandwidth to really get into the protests right now. Important question. Anyone know what that firework gun thing was being used by the protesters? So they're talking about the protests in Georgia. Someone came up with like an automatic like firework Gatling gun that they were shooting at cops, and it was rad. I'm sure someone can do a YouTube video on it. As an American who woke up to the news of thousands of Americans murdered on 9/11, I'm not going to cheer on Al-Qaeda rebels. Yeah, that narrative didn't last long because now they're starting to call them MSM. Mainstream media is starting to call them Al-Qaeda or former Al-Qaeda, which is a step up from rebels or freedom fighters. So I wish CNN showed informative maps instead of hiding border lines and obfuscating occupation zones, calling Al-Qaeda rebels SDF Syrian people and shit like that. Syrian people stand with Damascus. Some do. Plenty don't. We have to recognize that people are not a monolith, just like some people here stand with Biden, and some people stand with Harris, and some people stand with Trump, and yeah, some people just are not about any of those people, like me and probably you. So not monolithic, but yeah. Okay. NATO is a fascist club. They execute Hitler's plan, the Fourth Reich. Okay, that's okay. CIA and supported by the United Kingdom and some Arab intelligence services, especially Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Oh, and Saudi intelligence. Yep. Okay, yeah, see, I'm Syrian. Greg's take on the entire operation of HTS, including who HTS and what their motive is very off base, just like many Western pundits, Scott Ritter, George Galloway, Richard Medhurst. Okay, cool. Well, we will continue to discuss and expand knowledge bases and ideas. No one's getting canceled. This is a very complicated issue. And people are used to Israel-Palestine, guys. That's not a complicated conflict. That's an occupation. That's apartheid. And people will definitely say in Syria that, you know, Assad's government is an occupation. These are not CIA talking points. Millions of people in Syria believe this. So, yeah, this is why this is a challenging thing to navigate. Specifically, I do try to stay in my lane and talk about it from a military perspective and a Western analytical perspective, which I think is completely off base sometimes, but it's how I was trained and it's something I'm very critical of. So that's what I'm trying to do. So, okay, Greg, where do you think these rebels were training for the past few years? I mean, doesn't gaining combined arms training require some type of safe zone? So in 2011, 12, actually no, it's 2013. I think I don't know about HTS, but Syrian National Army, like the guys backed by Turkey went over the border to train in Turkey. That is something PBS Frontline actually did a documentary where they followed rebel groups backed by Turkey, went over the border to train in Turkey, and then bring guns back over the border into northern Syria. Safe zones are nice, so you don't get bombed by Russian or Syrian air assets. So Turkey would make sense. Where else were they trained? Probably not Lebanon. So, yeah. Is Erdogan trying to annex Aleppo and Idlib unofficially? I mean, definitely wants to increase the buffer zone between Turkey's southern border and northern Syria. I don't know how we would get away with annexing sovereign territory in the modern era, but who knows? Okay, what percentage of the rebel forces do you think are disaffected Syrians who basically got a better job offer from the rebel leaders versus jihadists from abroad? Well, there's a lot of disaffected Sunni people in Syria. that are open to various groups that have a spectrum from being more radical to more moderate. There are also foreign fighters, but unfortunately, like, we don't have like a census for that. We know there are foreign fighters. We know there are Syrians. I would assume that the bulk of these forces would actually be native Syrians. There are legitimate grievances against the government, and that's something we all have to recognize, I believe. However, what's the end game? What's the end goal? So that's something for y'all to decide. I was trying to do a non-didactic Syria episode where I'm not trying to tell you what to think. Maybe I succeeded, maybe I didn't. But I just wanted to highlight some dynamics. So if you want to unequivocally support the resistance, go ahead. Just know that you're going to catch heat. This is very sensitive and very complicated topic. And I just hope the overall movement isn't fractured by it. So let's just keep that in mind, and let's keep an ongoing dialogue and continue to educate each other and listen. Yeah. So this was my personal take, and yeah, guys, I hope it was helpful. We're going to be doing more episodes on this. I think I'm going to try to get Syriana analysis on here for the Thursday episode. I messaged him. I think he may have gotten back to me now. I'll check about that. So hope to get into it then. This will be a developing story, ongoing situation, and expanding knowledge base for everybody going forward. Thanks so much, y'all. This has been State of Play on Mint Press News. See you Thursday.